Hello and welcome to Day of the Dead, the card game. In this game, you and a friend are rival necromancers, summoning teams of undead fighters to compete in the Day of the Dead games. Each turn, you'll raise new fighters to the field, then go down the line comparing power. Winners will score you points, while losers are flipped face down. Don't give up on the losers just yet though, they come back to life again next turn. But if you hate to see the same guy lose over and over, you can pull him out of line and turn him into a spirit. Spirits are powerful allies that make all of your fighters stronger and even let you replace the less desirable ones. At the end of 6 turns, the cleverest necromancer is named Super Grand Master. In order to play, you'll need 2 players and about 30 minutes. Day of the Dead comes with 3 decks: Unearth, Power Up, and Double. These decks represent the 3 different forms of spirits your fighters can become. We'll learn more about spirits a little later. At the start of the game, each player is dealt 3 cards from each of these decks. These cards represent the skeletons, zombies, demons, and other bizarre characters you will use to defeat your opponent. The front, or active side of each card has basic information about your fighter, such as its name and what deck it belongs to. All fighters also have an effect and a power value. Effects are abilities that make each fighter unique. They range from massive game-changing rewards to just simple small bonuses. The power value is used to determine the outcome of fights. The more you add on to this number, the more likely it is for your fighter to win. When a fighter wins its battle, you will score victory points equal to its printed power. Typically, cards with lower printed power have stronger effects and are more likely to win the fight, whereas cards with higher printed power earn you more victory points when they win, but have weak effects or even drawbacks. One player is also randomly given the priority counter. Whoever holds this token gets to use their effects first. Let's get ready for the first turn. Each turn is divided into 3 parts: summoning, fighting, and rewards. In summoning, each player brings a new fighter to the field. In fighting, your undead creatures do battle with your opponent's creations. In rewards, you score victory points for any of your fighters that are still standing. Okay, let's get to summoning. The first thing that happens is a new slot opens. You may be wondering what a new slot is right now. To answer that question, let's look at the game setup. Each player has space to place 6 cards in front of them. These 12 spaces are called slots, the locations where your fighters will line up ready to work. The 12 slots together are called the field. Each turn, a new slot opens on the field for each player. That means on turn 1, you'll each have access to 1 slot, on turn 2, 2, turn 3, 3 slots, etc. On the first turn, each player takes a card from their hand and places it face down as a fallen fighter in this first new slot. On each turn after that, you will take your current spirit card and place it there. Before a fighter can enter the field and claim a slot as its own, it must start out as a spirit. Spirits are played face down and slightly below the rest of your fighters. You can only have 1 spirit at a time. Spirits are also rotated 90 degrees to show that they're special. Since your spirit will become a fighter next turn, it's important to plan ahead and try and pick a card that works with the fighters you already played, or that you think will do well against whatever your opponent might have planned. Another thing to consider is that we can only have 2 cards of each back in play. On turn 6, the final turn, we are allowed to break this rule and choose any card back we want, but until then, we're going to have to be conservative about the cards that we play. Now that we've got that sorted out, flip all the cards on the field, that's all the cards in the center and not the spirits, face up. Now we can move on to fighting. Each turn is a series of fights, one-on-one battles that go from the newest slots to the oldest slots. Since each player has only 1 slot this turn, there's only going to be 1 fight, but each turn after this will add on 1 more fight till we finally end on the 6th turn with 6 fights. Individual fights are actually pretty simple. First, fighters get to use their effects. The player with the priority counter gets to use their effect first. Then, fighters add any power bonuses they might have gotten via effects to their printed power. Next, they compare their total power to their opponent's. The highest power fighter stays face up or active, and the lowest fighter gets flipped face down or becomes fallen. The loser then can be pulled from its line by its owner. Finally, it's time to move on to the next fight down the line. Alright, let's get started with our first fight. Our fighter is called Anger. He has 3 printed power, which isn't very high. However, his effect reads you get +5 power this fight, meaning his bad disposition increases his fighting strength from 3 to a much larger 8. We picked him this early because we don't know what our opponent's up to, and thanks to his effect, he should always have a consistently high power. Meanwhile, our opponent has selected Oaf. Oaf has a huge printed power of 7, but due to insufficient schooling or whatever, he never bothered to learn a trade and has no effect. This means that in a fight, Anger's total power of 8 is higher than Oaf's total power of 7 and will win. However, there's more at work here than just these 2 fighters. Your choice of spirit, and sometimes even who has priority, can affect a fight's outcome. For example, your opponent has selected Power Up as their spirit. As long as Power Up is their spirit, your opponent gets +2 power during each of their fights. The small boost is enough to give Oaf 9 total power, making him stronger than Anger and the real winner of the fight. But let's fight and see what our spirit can do. Maybe it'll turn things around for us. The first thing that we need to do is to use effects. Since we have priority, we're going to go first. Not that it really matters much because Oaf doesn't have any effects. Anger's effect will give us +5 power this fight. However, since we know that Oaf has a power-up spirit, this doesn't look good for us right now. Luckily, we have a spirit of our own, and it's very good with Anger. We selected Double, which makes all of our fighters use their effects twice in a fight. We use our card's effect like normal, but then get to use it a second time. So, in Anger's case, we will get +5 power this fight, then an additional +5 power this fight for a total bonus of +10 power. It's looking good for us. Now, let's add up the power. We already have +10 power thanks to our effect and Double, and with our printed power of 3, that's 13 total power. Oaf has 7 printed power, and thanks to the power-up spirit, another 2 power on top of that. That means we will have 13 total power to Oaf's 9, destroying him. Anger goes back down to his printed power of 3, and Oaf is flipped face down. The game now looks something like this. At this point, our opponent would be given the option of pulling Oaf from the line and turning him into a spirit. Normally it makes sense to do this because if a fighter loses a fight, then there's a good chance that they will lose the same fight next turn and so on. But maybe our opponent has something planned or they're stupid or something, but they chose to decline this opportunity. After that, we would move on to the next fight, but since there are no more fights this turn, let's move on to the rewards portion of the turn. Just as it sounds, we are about to be rewarded for our wise choice of playing Anger first. Each player scores victory points equal to the printed powers of all their active fighters. Since Anger is the only active fighter in play, we score 3 points. We're now going to have a 3-0 lead. Finally, it's time to pass priority to our opponent. This means that during the next turn, our opponent will use their fighter's effects first. This is what the board looks like before we start turn 2. Okay, ready? Let's get started on turn 2. Just like last turn, a new slot will open up. However, unlike last turn, where we added a card from our hand to this slot, we will take our spirit from last turn and place it in the new slot. Now we play our new card for the turn as a spirit. We're going with the power-up card this time, and our opponent has selected a double. The field becomes active, and each player has 2 fighters ready to go. Fights always go from the newest slot to the oldest, so this fight will feature the 2 new fighters. Our fighter is called Cannibal. Much like Anger, he has a low printed power, but his effect gets him stronger. His effect reads Dig, then +X power this fight, where X is the power of the card you discarded. When you dig, you draw a card from any deck, then discard a card from your hand with the matching back. So for example, if we drew a card with the Unearth deck, we would then pick an Unearth card from our hand, even one we just drew if we want, and put it into the discard pile next to that deck. Discarded cards are out of play. For Cannibal, the printed power of the card you discard is important. Cannibal gives you a power bonus for the fight equal to the printed power of the card you discarded. So if we discard a card like Anger, Cannibal would get a small bonus and become 5 power. If we discard a card like Oath, for instance, Cannibal would give us a huge +7 power bonus, making him 9 power. When using Cannibal, you have to balance the need to use Dig to improve the quality of the cards in your hand with the need to win the fight. Meanwhile, our opponent will be using a card called Lackey. Lackey is also a small card, and at only 2 power, it relies on the strength of your other fighters to win. Positioning Lackey is key. If your next fighter to fight this turn has 5 printed power or more, then Lackey gives you a +7 power bonus for this fight. Since Lackey is fighting right before Oath, he gets this huge power bonus. This is probably the reason that Oath wasn't moved last turn. If our opponent did, then Lackey wouldn't have a large fighter to get the bonus from. Alright, time to use effects. Lackey gets to go first since our opponent has priority, and between his effect and our opponent's double spirit, they already have 14 power. Since Cannibal probably isn't going to win this fight, as no card has even close to 14 printed power, let's just discard a card with 3 power. It lets us get rid of a card we don't want, and hopefully we will draw into a high power card that we can get rid of when Lackey is a little more vulnerable. It's pretty obvious that Lackey won, but we'll finish out the fight. Adding on his printed power, Lackey has 16 power total, and even with power up, Cannibal has only 7 power. Lackey wins the fight, and Cannibal is flipped face down. I don't think it's wise to move Cannibal, because it's a pretty even matchup that's more decided by our choice of spirit. And we move back to Anger versus Oath, and things should work the same as they did before. Oath is double, but that doesn't really help him at all, and we even have a power up to make the fight more in our favor. Anger is going to have 10 power to Oath 7, winning the fight. The best part of this is that our opponent doesn't want to move Oath because Lackey won't be able to get all that extra power if there's no fighter after it, so we should be able to keep winning over and over again. That was our last fight for the turn, so after this we will move to score victory points. This turn, Anger and Lackey won, so we score 3 points and our opponent scores 2, making the score 6-2 in our favor. We then get priority back and move on to turn 3. As soon as the third turn starts, the third slot will open and we will move our former spirit into it. Once this is done, we get to select new spirits. For their new spirit, our opponent has chosen double again. They won't be able to play another card with this back until the final turn. Meanwhile, we're going to try an Unearth Spirit and see what happens. Once the field becomes active, our Unearth Spirit will get to work. Unearth is very different from double and power up. Rather than helping your fighters do better, it simply lets you replace your least desirable fighter. We can replace any single card on our side of the field, or we can choose to replace the spirit itself. We're picking Anger to replace, not because it hasn't been winning, but because the new card our opponent played looks powerful, and we're going to need to gain points more quickly if we want to keep up. To unearth Anger, we take it and put it into the discard pile of its deck. Anger was from the Unearth deck, so we'll put it there. Next, we look at the top 3 cards of the deck Anger came from, the Unearth deck. We pick one card from those to replace Anger, a card called Bone. The rest are discarded. Finally, the new card Bone is placed in the spot that was occupied by Anger. Since Anger was active, so was Bone. If we were replacing a fallen fighter or our spirit, Bone would be placed face down, which can be a way to catch your opponent off guard and sneak a new fighter into play. With our new card firmly in place, it's time to fight again. This time, we're starting off with the third slot. Our new card is called Wisdom, another 3 power fighter. Wisdom gets stronger for each card in our hand. Unfortunately for us, we don't draw cards regularly in this game. We started the game with 9 cards in hand, and now on the third turn we only have 5 left. That will effectively give Wisdom 8 power this turn, but next turn it will only have 7, and then 6, and finally 5. Wisdom is best used early while your hand is still large. Meanwhile, our opponent has picked a card called Resist. It really doesn't like that its owner is losing and improves its printed power of 6 with another 6. As long as our opponent has victory points less than or equal to us, this large bonus will be in effect. But as soon as we are behind, our opponent's resist will have a useless effect. Okay, now it's time to use effects. We have priority, so Wisdom starts first and gets +5 power for the 5 cards in our hand. Now it's time for resist to go. Since our opponent is losing, that's +6 power, and thanks to double, another +6 power. Adding up the power, Wisdom gets another 3 for its printer power for a total of only 8. Resist, on the other hand, has a monstrous power of 18. Wisdom gets flipped face down and Resist stays active. We could make Wisdom into a spirit, but I'm not sure we have a lot that can deal with Resist right now, so let's move on. Thanks to that double, things don't look much better for Cannibal this time around. We're going first, but once again, it doesn't seem wise to discard any high power cards. We'll just get rid of a 5 power card instead. Meanwhile, Lackey has a huge +14 bonus this time, and we add up the power, but it's clear that Lackey will have more and will win. Not much can be done here, and Cannibal will get much better next turn now that our opponent has exhausted their ability to play new double cards for a while, so let's keep it and move on. Remember Bone? That fighter we got when we unearthed Anger? As it turns out, he's just what we need for this turn. He has 6 power and gets +1 power for each fallen card we have. That means that our spirit and any of our fighters that lost this turn will make him better. Alright, let's get ready to see him in action. Thanks to our spirit and our 2 fighters that lost this turn, Bone will get +3 power. Adding that onto his printed power, we will have 9, more than enough to beat Oaf once again. I'm starting to feel bad for the guy, but it's not our problem. Alright, let's collect our victory points now. We score 6, and our opponent will score 8, keeping us slightly in the lead at 12-10. Our opponent will have priority on turn 4, and we go through the usual setup. A new slot will open up for both players, and our former spirits will go to them. And once that's out of the way, then we get to play a new card for the turn. Now, oddly enough, both sides are going to be getting power-up spirits, which effectively cancels out the bonus they would provide. Then, once the field becomes active, it's time to fight again. And our new card for the turn will be a card called Charity. At 8 power, it's huge. 8 power is a lot, but it has a huge drawback to go with that 8 power. Your opponent gains 4 victory points. Now, since our opponent has a card like Resist, this could be helpful. We'll see. Now, our opponent has a card called Nemesis, and Nemesis only has 1 power, not a lot, but its effect lets it win the fight right now, which means we don't get to add up the power or compare power, and since our opponent has priority, we won't even get to use our effects this turn. This fight's basically over before it even gets started. Nemesis will use its effect and win right away, flipping Charity face down. There isn't much reason to turn into a spirit yet because I think our next turn's play will fix things. Moving on, we have Wisdom versus Resist. Since Charity wasn't able to use its effect, Resist is going to still be huge, too large to really deal with. Wisdom will lose again, unfortunately. However, there is the hope that next turn we can fix this problem and Wisdom will be big enough to win. So we'll see. Let's not turn our fighter into a spirit. Instead, move on to the next fight. It's going to be Cannibal versus Lackey again, but this time I think we have the edge because our opponent doesn't have a double spirit. In fact, we both have the same spirits. So we just discard a higher power card than Lackey's effect gives it, and then when we add up the points, we should come out slightly ahead. And sure enough, we win the fight, and our opponent chooses not to turn their card into a spirit. We just move on to the Bone versus Oaf matchup. Now, the one advantage to losing the first two fights is we can count on Bone to have a huge bonus from its effect. And once we go to adding up the power, this proves true, and Bone will have a higher power than Oaf does, winning the fight. Our opponent, once again, wants to keep Lackey getting bigger so they don't turn Oaf into a spirit. And we move on to the rewards portion of the turn and score victory points. We're going to end the turn scoring 8 points to our opponent's 7, which means we keep our slight lead at 20 to 17. Next turn we'll have priority and we'll be able to make use of charity and make sure our opponent is slightly ahead of us. Beating resist is critical since our opponent is gaining most of their points in that one matchup. So turn 5 starts the way they always do. The turn 5 slot will open up. Our former spirits will go into it, and then we get to play a new card to be our new spirit. We're going to use a double spirit to take advantage of our new fighter for the turn and the fact that we have priority. We'll get introduced to him a little later. Our opponent's going to go with Unearth. That makes a lot of sense because this way he's finally able to get rid of Oaf, which hasn't been winning a lot, and this also has the potential benefit of defeating Bone, which we've been getting a lot of points off of. And the card selected also has 5 power, which is enough to trigger Lackey. For the first fight of the turn, we have the perfect card for our current situation. Control only has 4 power, but doesn't really concern itself with conventional fighting. Instead, it uses its effect to remove the effects of other cards. You could use Control to remove drawbacks from your own cards, or we can make effect-driven cards like Nemesis basically useless, shutting our opponent down. Our opponent has another strong card, Nightmare. Nightmare can use the effect of any active fighter, and Nightmare gets better with cards like Nemesis on the board. It's a good thing we have priority because Nightmare can make just as much use out of our control as we can. So, in the fight, it's a good thing we have priority. We get to use our Control and Double Spirit to get rid of the effects on our opponent's scariest cards right now, which would be Nightmare and Nemesis. This should slow our opponent down a great deal. Since Nightmare has no effect this turn, we go straight to comparing power. Both cards have the same power, so the fight is a tie. Both cards will stay face up and score victory points. Now, Charity is going to beat Nemesis since it doesn't have an effect, but we are going to give our opponent a lot of points for their trouble. Charity with the Double Spirit donates 8 victory points to our opponent. It may look like we're basically breaking even this fight, but since our opponent gains their 8 victory points now, and we will get our 8 victory points at the end of the turn, we will be behind when Resist gets a chance to use their effect, and Resist effect won't do anything. This means that Wisdom will be able to beat Resist in a fight this turn, and we will more than make up for breaking even so far. So, true to form, Wisdom uses its effect twice, gaining tons of power, and Resist doesn't really get any points. Adding up the power, Wisdom will have a much higher power than Resist and wins the fight. Our opponent chooses not to turn their card into a spirit, and we move on to the next fight. Cannibal versus Lackey. We have a huge advantage in our double spirit. It basically means that we can throw away any cards we want to dig and still have a much higher power than Lackey does. Adding up the power proves this, and Cannibal wins the fight, beating Lackey easily. The final fight of the turn doesn't look too good for us, though. Our opponent has a new card called Junior, and he gets +1 power for every fight so far this turn, including this one. That's +5 power on a card that already has 5 power. Normally, the drawback on a card like this would be that you have to play it very early and wait for it to get this huge, but since our opponent used Unearth, they skipped all this work. On top of that, Bone's effect only gives it +1 power this turn, since we've won or tied every other fight. Double does practically nothing with those kinds of numbers. We lose this fight pretty convincingly. In fact, we're going to turn Bone into our new spirit. Up until now, we haven't had much reason to pull a card and turn it into a spirit. We were consistently ahead in points and even won almost every fight this turn. So why change things now? Well, next turn is the last turn of the game, and Junior is only going to get stronger. If Bone is more powerful than him, then it probably means we lost every fight and with it the game. Also, our opponent is going to have priority next turn, so that means that Control won't be able to stop Nightmare like he did this turn. So we need something in the first slot to deal with Nightmare and in the last slot to overcome Junior. Since Bone has an Unearth back, we can fix one of these slots. To make Bone a spirit, we must pull it from the field. After we've done that, we will fill the gap by moving our fighters that were before it in line down one slot. Next, we remove our old spirit from its slot. After that, it joins the field at the start of our line. Finally, Bone becomes our new spirit. If Bone were a double or a power-up card, our work here would be done and those spirits would simply affect any fights we had for the rest of the turn, or at least until we replace them with a different spirit. But with Unearth, as soon as it becomes our new spirit, we must use its ability to replace our fighters. Let's get rid of Cannibal and replace it with something that stands a better chance against Junior. We're replacing it with the card with 5 power, which has an additional bonus for us. During the rewards portion of the turn, you score victory points for all your active fighters, regardless of whether or not they fought. This means that our new card gets to score us more points than Cannibal ever could. We score 20 points to our opponent's 9, ending the turn with a 40 to 34 point lead. The next thing that happens is we pass priority to our opponent. On turn 6, we are able to choose whatever card back we want to be our spirit. We're going with Unearth since we may have a card that can deal with Junior right now, but we still need something to address Nightmare. Our opponent is going with Double, which should work well with their many effect-driven fighters. Once the field becomes active, we will get to work replacing Bone. Its effect isn't very helpful during the first fight, since we haven't lost anything yet, and we desperately need something that can get to work before Nightmare becomes active. We find something that should be able to do the trick though. It's a card called Cancel. Then we should be ready for the first fight of the turn. Our card Cancel says, during the next fight this turn, no fighter may use effects. This card is wonderful when we have fighters like Charity that would prefer not to have effects in the first place, and our opponent has cards like Nemesis that depend on their effects to win fights. It also seems like a perfect way to stop Nightmare from copying several strong effects and making us lose several key fights. Our opponent, meanwhile, has played a card called Greed. Greed is great in the late game when your score is relatively high. He gains you 1 victory point for every 10 victory points you have, perfect for inflating your score or pulling ahead in a tight race like this one. In the fight, our opponent has a double spirit for their Greed, meaning they will get to gain 3 points and go from 34 to 37, then gain another 3 points and go from 37 to 40. Cancel's effect may not impact this fight, but it will mean a lot for us in the next one. Comparing power is easy, as neither fighter has any sort of bonus power. Good for us, Cancel has 1 more power than Greed and wins the fight. The next fight will be our new card Forget versus Nightmare. Forget is a high power card that works well with other high power cards. It's got 7 power and an effect that makes you pick one of your fighters after Forget and force that card to lose its effects for the turn. It's great with cards like Charity, because in most scenarios you don't want your opponent gaining extra victory points. But because of Cancel, we won't be able to use Forget's effect to overcome Charity's drawback. Still, it's more important to make sure Nightmare can't do anything. Since neither card has an effect, we simply compare powers and Forget comes out way ahead. This next fight is going to be an unfortunate sacrifice. We won't even be able to use Control's amazing effect because our opponent has priority and a Nemesis. Nemesis simply uses its effect and wins. There is one good thing to come out of this, and that's we can turn control into a spirit and have a power-up spirit helping us throughout the rest of the fights rather than a used-up unearth. Because this is the last turn, there are no future turns to consider before making this move. You don't have to worry about whether or not this will be a negative thing in the long run because there is no more long run. It's purely short term on the last turn. Once the spirit's finally in place, we can move on to the next matchup of the turn. This is a fight between Charity and Resist. It isn't going to go well for us because we have a tie score, so our opponent still technically has the least victory points. If we had priority, Charity could use its effect and fix this situation for us, but no such luck. Resist will get an easy win, and to make matters worse, Charity will give away a free 4 victory points. Not our greatest of fights, but it's alright. Similarly, Wisdom isn't going to have much hope of beating Lackey. We're going to lose this one too. Wisdom's at its weakest at this point, and Lackey has been consistently getting the same bonus, and the fact that our opponent has a double just makes it worse. If we wanted to get creative, we could have made Charity into our spirit and unearthed into something that could have beaten Lackey, but don't worry, there's no need. Our final fighter is a card called Famine, and it should be more than enough for us to win the game. Now, Famine has 5 printed power, and an effect that doesn't increase its power, so it won't be able to beat Junior in a fight. However, its effect is amazingly strong in a close late game, and works a little like a reverse version of Greed. If you have the least victory points, your opponent loses 1 victory point for every 5 that they have. This will make sure that we win. So after Junior uses its effect, it basically becomes impossible for us to fight. Famine will get to work on their other resource, victory points. At 44 victory points, our opponent will lose 8 points, going down to 36. With one well-placed card, we basically negated all the points that Junior, Lackey, and Nemesis would gain this turn. This is it. We get to score points one last time and see who wins. In the end, we're going to score 12 points this turn to our opponent's 14. That'll make the score 52-50 in our favor, a close one. Congratulations on winning your very first game of Day of the Dead. I hope you enjoyed it.